August, the parliamentary year is drawing to a close, but the fights are far from over. Today's brawl was about the $11 billion mining tax. The coalition is implacably opposed, but the government's won the support of the lower house independents in exchange for some trade-offs. But as political editor Chris Uhlmann reports, when the political debate today shifted to a real battlefield, Afghanistan, the major parties stuck together.
The end of a divisive year is nigh, and 12 months' worth of arguments are being run and rerun. Most days in Canberra you can even get an argument about the weather.
What's happened to summer? It's a bit wintry out here.
Beautiful day. We've got the mineral resource rent tax before the Parliament for debate today.
Border protection failures continue. The miners themselves recognise that they should pay more tax.
The carbon tax modelling is in tatters.
What we'll see is the government and the Greens guillotining through a whole host of legislation.
The imprisonment and detention of Indonesian children in Australian facilities.
But with the government signalling budget cuts just over the horizon, Tony Abbott has written to the Prime Minister demanding Parliament sit another week.
Parliament should not rise for the year without a mini-budget to face up to the carbon tax rip-off and to address the fact that the government is never going to get the budget back into surplus next year without significant additional savings.
Not everyone in the coalition got the memo.
How about Parliament? Should it sit for an extra week?
To
next week?
For what purpose?
The disputes aren't just between parties. Labor's gearing up for an end-of-year stoush at its national conference in a fortnight.
Uranium in particular is one that we have a different view to that which was recently announced by the Prime Minister.
The Prime Minister herself has said she wants a robust conference, and I think there will be a robust conference. I'm looking forward to it.
But with the opening of both houses, the Prime Minister reported on an actual battle where both major parties are in furious agreement.
There must be no safe haven for terrorists in Afghanistan.
Our armed forces are more than ready to fight for our country, but they need to know that it is indeed our country's fight.
The toll of death and injury has risen sharply over the past 2 years.
We mourn the 32 young Australians killed in Afghanistan. They are our finest. We honour them and we will never forget them. We also remember the 213 who have been wounded in the line of duty.
Many will not serve again. Some will not walk again.
And both leaders know the death of 4 Australians at the hands of Afghan troops threatens to further erode public support for the mission.
It is critical that we show restraint and reserve our judgments until the investigation of these incidents is complete. We do not yet have grounds to conclude that these attacks represent a pattern or were directed with a purpose.
The aim is to hand over Afghanistan's security to local forces by 2014, but there's no end in sight to Australia's commitment.
The government will keep under consideration a continued Australian Special Forces presence in Afghanistan beyond 2014.
The Greens have long opposed continuing the mission.
Even the United States has a timetable for withdrawal and is starting to bring its troops home. We seem to be going in the opposite direction, and that is directly against the will of the Australian people.
Outside Afghanistan, the opposition and government prefer to parade their differences.
No country ever got rich by hitting itself with more taxes.
And the government thinks it's now on a winner with its $11 billion mining tax.
This is a really important economic reform for Australia that grasps the challenges of the future. And that's why I'm at a loss to understand why Tony Abbott has got his wrecking ball out again.
The lower house support is lining up.
We are both going to support it.
I'll cut straight to the chase. I have agreed to support the minerals resource rent tax legislation, which I understand now gives the government the numbers to see the MRRT pass through the House of Representatives this week.
The independents have extracted a price for their support. Tony Windsor won $200 million over 5 years to pay for ecological assessments of the effects of coal seam gas extraction. Andrew Wilkie was concerned about the effect of the tax on smaller miners, so he got the government to lift the starting point for the mining tax from $50 to $75 million. That cuts $20 million a year from revenue. So the cost of Lower House compromise is about $60 million a year. The Greens are the final hurdle.
The bill will have our support if it's revenue neutral, so it's up to the government to be creative.
The government won't need to be too creative in its accounting. To make the changes revenue neutral, it only has to cover the $20 million a year in foregone tax. That will be accounted for in next week's mid-year economic update.
Mr Speaker, this is a very important day in the history of economic reform in our country. Economic reform to increase prosperity. And of course those opposite, Mr Speaker, they can only say no.
The independent support turns the heat on the opposition.
Whatever happens, we will be opposing this tax in opposition, and we will be rescinding it in government should we get the chance.
That means getting rid of a tax the big miners say they can afford and agreeing to pay some of the benefits it provides without the revenue. Little wonder then that even some in the coalition are questioning how that can all add up.
Political editor Chris Uhlmann.